The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. It's Friday and we're just going to run through some of the week's top stories. A lot of these appear in the Trumpet Weekly, which we e-publish every Friday afternoon. And we've got almost 23,000 subscribers to the Trumpet Weekly now. So if you don't have your own subscription to that weekly email, just go to thetrumpet.com and make sure that you get your subscription today. All right, to start off, Charles Krauthammer, he wrote a column today called the Sucker's Deal, and he said in this, it's talking about the oncoming deal between the West and Iran over the nuclear program, and he says, a president desperate to change the subject and a Secretary of State desperate to make a name for himself are reportedly on the verge of an interim nuclear agreement with Iran. France called it a Sucker's Deal. France, he says, was being charitable. And then Krauthammer goes on to say, the only reason Iran has come to the table after a decade of contemptuous stonewalling is that economic sanctions have cut so deeply, its currency has collapsed, inflation is rampant, that the regime fears a threat to its very survival. So the West actually was gaining some leverage there with these crippling sanctions, and now evidently the groups of nations that are about to strike a deal here are prepared to give that up and to throw them a lifeline and to not stop that nuclear program. This ties in with another article that was posted just today at her website, Melanie Phillips, who titled her article, It's 1938 All Over Again. The title speaks for itself. Here we are, not learning the lesson from history, making the very same mistakes. She talked in that blog posting about how when Rouhani came into power in June, the West saw him as a reformer, and we've talked about this before on this program, so we don't need to repeat all of that. But as she brings out in her posting, Rouhani doesn't run Iran. The mullahs do, or more precisely, the Ayatollah. He's the one that runs the nation and has been for many, many years. Rouhani's just a puppet, really. Now, Khomeini, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, earlier this week he said that the Jews of Israel cannot be called humans. They are like animals, some of them. That's what he said just this week, that they're not even considered humans. He said Israel was the rabid dog of the region. Now that's what Iran is saying this week as Western nations are gathering in Geneva to try to lift the sanctions that are crippling that nation that wants to destroy Israel, not to mention the West, the United States in particular. From Phillips' article, she says, what do you do with rabid dogs? She's playing off that quote from Khomeini. She says, that's right, you put them down. That's what Khomeini intends to do to the Jews of Israel. That's why he says Israel is doomed to collapse, and why his regime has repeatedly declared it will wipe Israel off the page of history. Dehumanizing the Jews, ring any bells, she says? Know what happened next? But it's not just the Jews who are in Iran's sights. It's the West, upon which it has been waging a self-declared war since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. We had a program a few weeks back about the 30-some-year war Iran has been waging against the West, against the United States, against Israel, using all of its proxies, its international terror network. It's been going on for decades. Notice what Phillips has to say about that war. The most stunning aspect of the Iranian war against the West, however, is that since 1979, the West has effectively denied that it's taking place. It's just not happening. We turn a blind eye to it. We act like it's not there. She says, for the West, war with Iran has always been seen as infinitely worse than war by Iran, regardless of the body count of its innocent victims. And now, this suicidal farce has reached its last act, with the West tragically still in appeasement mode. We're entering into the final act, she says. What is currently on the table is a deal that will allow Iran to keep all of its centrifuges and proceed inexorably to make its nukes, with the sanctions that have finally begun to bite being eased in return for precisely nothing. Nothing in return. This is the so-called interim agreement that's just going to buy Iran six months to continue with its program, during which time, of course, the sanctions will be eased. And as so many have written in opinion pieces and commentaries, once you lift the sanctions, once you ease the sanctions, it's going to be next to impossible to implement them again, to put them in force again. Because people will say, well, if we crack down on them all the more, that's just going to make them race that much faster to try to build a nuclear bomb. We don't want to make them upset. We don't want to get them angry. As it is, those sanctions that are in place right now are really beginning to have an impact. But the West is preparing to lift them, or at least a good part of them. She goes on to say, the West is now on the verge of handing to Iran on a plate what it once said was unthinkable. Obama, Ashton, and Cameron might as well go to Tehran and wave a white flag. Notice how she concludes her posting. She says, we are indeed now facing the unthinkable, not just that Iran is on the verge of being allowed to proceed to nuclear capability. The really unthinkable reality is that the enemies of the civilized world are not just to be found in Tehran, they are also in London, Brussels, and Washington, D.C. That's quite a hard-hitting conclusion, but it's the truth. It's the truth. The BBC, by the way, reported earlier this week that David Cameron, he made a phone call to Rouhani. He became the first UK Prime Minister to do so in more than a decade. He called him up, according to the BBC, a Downing Street spokesman said of Tuesday's phone call. The two leaders discussed the bilateral relationship between Britain and Iran, welcoming the steps taken since President Rouhani took office. See, he's a reformer. He's different. He wants peace, so our leaders think. And so here's another shameful phone call. If you've read anything at our website recently, you know all about the phone call that President Obama made as Rouhani was leaving the recent gathering at the United Nations. Shameful phone call, the most shameful phone call in American history, my father said. Here's the President of the United States reaching out to this so-called reformer. Here's now the UK Prime Minister doing the same thing. That's not much of a show of strength coming from the end-time nations of Israel today. There's another article that appeared in Politico this past week about the break in the relationship between the United States and Israel. That's another angle to this story that we've been covering frequently here at the Trumpet and on the Trumpet Daily. You can go back either at the YouTube channel or on the Trumpet Daily tab there at the website and find that program revolving around Prime Minister Netanyahu's recent speech at the UN back in October, where he was warning the world about what was coming, and then there was the response to the Geneva deal that was almost struck a couple of weeks ago, where he came out with the strongest of language condemning that deal that now looks like it's very near to be completed. From Politico, it says Netanyahu's denunciation of the proposed interim agreement with Iran as the deal of the century for that country and a grievous historic error effectively painted President Obama in an unflattering light as either a rube too naive to understand Iran's intentions or insufficiently committed to Israel's security. It says that rhetoric angered White House officials who believe the Israeli leader was distorting the provisions of the proposed agreement. That's what you see in the way of anger coming from the White House. It's generally directed at Israel. The Ayatollah, meanwhile, can go on and talk about the rabid dog that's in Israel, and you hardly hear a thing coming out of Washington to denounce that sort of language, inflammatory, and they're backing it up with weapons soon. That's why they're pushing for those nuclear arms. It says, for its part, the White House has incensed advocates for Israel by portraying war as the likely, certain, or perhaps for some desired alternative to the Geneva talks. The White House is saying, well, Israel just wants war, and that's making the Israelis angry. And the Israelis are saying this is a grievous historic error, and that's making the officials in Washington angry, further dividing these two brother nations. Notice this quote. This is from White House Press Secretary Jay Carney. The American people do not want to march to war, Carney said, and it is important to understand that if pursuing a resolution diplomatically is disallowed or ruled out, what options then do we and our allies have to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon? That's quite a statement for Carney to make. If we can't find some sort of resolution diplomatically, what options are left on the table? I guess that's it. I guess all we have left is diplomatic appeasement. That's basically what he's saying. Now, when you look at how much the United States has lost, forget about the last 10 years, look at the last several decades, going back to Korea, Vietnam, more recently Iraq, Afghanistan. The cost is just piling higher and higher. You can see why Americans are war weary, for sure. But the reason that this is happening is because the pride of our power has been broken. Let me just read to you a couple of verses. This is from Leviticus 26. If you want to read along, Leviticus 26 and verse 19. It says, and I will break the pride of your power, and I will make your heaven as iron, and your earth as brass. Verse 20 says, and your strength shall be spent in vain, for your land shall not yield her increase, neither shall the trees of the land yield their fruits. I mean, our strength is out there being spent to the tune of trillions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives, American lives. And what do we have to show for it? Just this past week, we had to beg Afghanistan to stay in that country for a little while past 2014. That's the state of America's foreign policy today. Everywhere else in the Middle East, we're on the run. And the last remaining outpost, Afghanistan, they really want us out of there, or an apology, or whatever it is that the terms are that they want for us to stay there. The pride of America's power has been broken, and this is something that this church and Herbert W. Armstrong before us has been preparing you for. A life after America. This is the latest, I just have the copy of the cover, but this is the latest cover we have for the Trumpet magazine, a striking image that we put together. What happens next? You can see the tombstone there, United States of America. What happens next? Life in the post-American world. That's what we're entering into. The death of a superpower. What happens after the United States falls from power? What happens when America's economy collapses? I'll get more into that here in just a second. What happens when we evacuate all these areas in the Middle East and elsewhere? Who will fill the void? And will it make the world a better place? Will it make the world safer? Well, this next issue, you need the Trumpet Weekly, as I said at the start, but make sure you also subscribe to the print edition of the Trumpet magazine, the monthly magazine that we produce, because we have pretty much the entire issue devoted to what happens next. Let me just go back to what Mr. Armstrong said. This is a quote from 1961 about America. He says, unless or until the United States as a whole repents and returns to what has become a hollow slogan on its dollars, in God we trust, the United States of America has won its last war. I mean, there's still awesome power. No one can deny that. But even as we speak, the Army, the Navy, I mean, they're being gutted. And the strength abroad is being spent in vain. And the pride and the power has been broken. So that's why we see what we're seeing around the world. America in retreat. This article, titled Lieberman, It's Time for Israel to Look at Other Allies. This was in the Jerusalem Post. just this past week, November 20th, Israel should not rely on the U.S. as much as it traditionally has, Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman said at the Sderot conference Wednesday. It quotes Lieberman, who says, "The Americans have a lot of problems and challenges around the world that they need to solve, and they have problems at home. We need to understand them and our place in the global arena. I mean, we need other allies. America's got plenty of issues that it's worried about and concerned about." The foreign minister, it says, who's filling in for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu while he's in Moscow, said that, quote, "Israel's foreign policy for many years went in one direction toward Washington, but my policy has more directions." Now, what have we been telling you about Israel turning elsewhere for help, for support? And already you've seen signs, even this year. Benjamin Netanyahu, on a series of interviews in October throughout Europe, trying to drum up support for some sort of strong action against Iran to stop the nuclear program. He was at the United Nations. Of course, that's here in the States, but he's speaking to all nations, trying to get them to awaken to what's happening there in the Middle East. Earlier this year, March 12th, an Israeli official, the president, Shimon Peres, he stood before the European Parliament and was basically begging them to to get involved in the region, to get involved in the Middle East, to get involved in putting down that Iranian threat. Already you see Israel's reaching out to Europe and Germany in particular, as we know they will from Bible prophecy. It's something to watch. We've got our eyes on it, as you know, and we'll keep you posted. This article from the Jerusalem Post also, it says Israel starting to consider the day after Iran agreement. The day after agreement. They know it's coming. These 5 nations plus 1 that are about to lift those sanctions. Netanyahu was in Russia, I believe, on Wednesday, talking to Vladimir Putin, of all things, about life after the agreement. What happens next? What happens next? Now that America is leading the way to appease Iran, what do we do next? And of course, it's Putin that he's talking with on Wednesday. Russia's had a resurgence. I'll read more on that here in just a second, but going back to this article in the Post, it says Netanyahu continued on Tuesday to implore the P5+1, the U.S., Russia, China, France, Britain, and Germany to improve the conditions of the deal shaping up. But as he did so, others began talking about strategy for the eventuality that a deal is signed when the sides meet on Wednesday in Geneva for the 3rd time this month. So you see the severing of the ties between the U.S. and Israel. You see a weakening stance in those groups of nations, particularly the United States and Britain. This is on that Russian resurgence. It's from the New York Times, November the 19th. Vladimir Putin clings to the past. It says the former republics of the Soviet Union have been sovereign, independent countries for almost 22 years, free to develop economic and political relations with any foreign nation or trading bloc they choose. That point appears to have eluded President Vladimir Putin of Russia, who's doing everything he can to prevent these countries from developing closer ties with Europe, even threatening to cut off the gas that one country needs to get through the winter. This is the New York Times, keep in mind, and it's talking about this divide between that old Russian empire and the emerging empire in Europe. The Cold War should be over for everyone, Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany said this week. Not, it appears, for Mr. Putin. That's the Times writing. And then it says later, Mr. Putin seems to long for, note this, Mr. Putin seems to long for a return to the days when an iron curtain divided the continent, darkening the horizons of the satellites and Soviet republics to the east, nations that now seek to enjoy more fully the fruits of independence. Now, I should just point out here that this is something that we've been also talking about for a number of years. My father said back in 2004, almost 10 years ago, that a more dictatorial Russian government is coming. You can see that in the January 2004 trumpet. He says the Europeans still remember how violent Russia was in World War II, and Russia is a close neighbor with massive piles of nuclear weapons. My father said the Russian election is triggering a fear that will hasten the uniting of the European Union. He was talking about those elections back in 2004. And so we see, again, the emergence of these two powers. They're certainly going to be filling much of that void, that vacuum left by the United States, the fall of the United States. This last one here on the Treasury, how it was forced to issue $1 trillion in new debt. This is from CNS News, November the 18th. It says here in the article how that over the past 6 weeks, the Treasury has issued more than $1 trillion in new debt. That's 6 weeks, $1 trillion in new debt. The article says the government needed $1 trillion to cover government obligations and expenses that exceeded the $255 billion it raked in through tax revenues during the same 6-week period. So it's taking in $250 billion and then added to that all this other new debt it's accumulating. Where did that combined $1 trillion in newly borrowed money and $255 billion in new tax revenues go? So we're talking about $1.2 trillion or so over a 6-week period. Where did it go? It says the lion's share went to pay off maturing securities the Treasury had sold before and had now come due. Now, it refers to this testimony that Treasury Secretary Jacob Lew recently gave, I think it was October the 10th, where he testified before Congress that most people don't understand that the Treasury needs, as he said, it needs to constantly borrow new money in order to meet ongoing expenses and to pay off the tremendous volume of old debt that the United States has accumulated. It says, let me remind everyone, and this is referring to Lew's testimony, it's in that CNS article, let me remind everyone, principal on the debt is not something we pay out of our cash flow of revenues. Principal on the debt is something that is a function of the markets rolling over. Now listen to this. Lew's description, this is CNS writing, Lew's description of the way the government handles its now $17 trillion plus debt mirrors the Securities and Exchange Commission's definition of a Ponzi scheme. It goes on and says, this is how the government defines a Ponzi scheme. It says a Ponzi scheme is an investment fraud that involves the payment of purported returns to existing investors from funds contributed by new investors. That's according to the Securities and Exchange Commission's own definition. A definition which pretty much is defining how the United States does business. America is basically running a Ponzi scheme. That's what that article is saying. Now, a Ponzi scheme, if you look at it in the corporate world, it's where an individual, a CEO or a board, whatever it is, pays off previous investors by income that it generates from new investors, foolish ones. It's a pyramid scheme where they have to get more and more and more new people to invest in order to pay off the old investors. And then once new investors can't be found, what happens? Well, the whole thing crashes down. The whole thing falls apart. When the U.S. borrows money, it does so from investors for lengths of time, whether it's 6 months or 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is. And at the end of that time, the U.S. then has to go and pay that money back plus interest that those investors are expecting. That's why they made the investment. But along the way, of course, America never saves up money from its tax collections to pay back these debts. It has to continually borrow more money to pay back those old debts. And right now, of course, it can continue to do so because, there's obviously the economy worldwide is not very strong anywhere right now. And the world is in worse financial shape in many ways than the United States. And at the same time, the Fed, of course, is just printing a lot of money, $85 billion per month, a lot of that going straight to the government to spend. And so you look at the scheme, I mean, it's definitely getting higher and higher. The bubble's getting more and more inflated. But when it pops, it is going to be a stunning crash. Right now, just the fact that interest rates are so low is also helping to sustain this bubble. But anyone who has any sense at all knows that a crash is coming. And when it comes, I mean, it is going to be stunning. Again, going back to this Trumpet article or this magazine edition, what happens after people abandon the dollar, after interest rates go up? What happens when there's no more investors to contribute to this Ponzi scheme? Well, that day is coming. We don't know exactly when, but we certainly know that it is coming. So make sure that you go to thetrumpet.com if you can and get your own subscription to both of these publications that we produce, whether it's the monthly magazine, The Trumpet, or the Trumpet Weekly, which, as I said, I believe the magazine has about 400,000 subscribers, and the Trumpet Weekly, the weekly newsletter that we e-publish, goes to 23,000 people. So a lot of these stories that I referred to today are in the latest issue of the Trumpet Weekly. So we'll probably be looking into a few of these stories for more of our Trumpet Daily broadcasts in the weeks ahead. We thank you for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next time.